Hello there, welcome back to the Closet Historian. Today we're going to be sewing down here in the sewing room. Yes, this little office is just a corner of a room and the rest of it is a sewing room that I rarely use to do any sewing. But we're going to sew something today. That's right, I'm going to sew something with you. So I'll be sewing, you'll be watching or listening more likely because this video will probably be quite long. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of you put me on almost like a podcast in the background, just prattling away about, seam finishes or something like that in the background. But for those of you who are interested in a little bit more of a detailed walkthrough of how I would go about making a 1940s, 50s inspired button back blouse like these ones, I'll put some on the screen now. This is kind of the style inspiring what I'm going to make today. I am going to take my basic bodice block sloper pattern, which is just like a sloper or block is a very basic pattern. Usually it's a 2-dart front, single dart back, and then it has a skirt pattern as a component of it as well. I'll put a example of a sloper pattern here. I recommend buying a pattern like this if you do not want to draft one from scratch and then modifying it to fit you perfectly and then using that to do pattern drafting. We might have a separate video about that coming up soon, just because I know a lot of people are intimidated about drafting a pattern to fit completely from measurements, from math, from scratch, but you can just take a dress pattern that is a 2-dart dress pattern or a sloper pattern from a commercial pattern company, modify that to fit you, and then use that as your bodice block to do things like I will be showing you how I do today. So I have a sloper that fits me. I highly recommend you working out how to get a sloper that fits you. If you are even a beginner, not like a super beginner, but past very beginning to like intermediate, once you have used a couple of patterns and you get the general idea of how clothes fit together, I really think it's worth it just to start learning to do pattern drafting as well, because once you have a bodice block and a skirt pattern that fit you, you can modify that so easily into other styles and it will still fit, which I think is much easier than having to refit a new commercial pattern every time you want to make something. But I have a soapbox sort of situation on pattern drafting. I think everyone should learn. I'm happy to teach you, hopefully sometime in the future, how to do draft a sloper and bodice block yourself, even from scratch. But today I'm just going to be making this blouse. I hope you guys enjoy watching with me, but I will show you how I modified my pattern basically. So if you are interested in pattern drafting, this will have a little bit of a tutorial here on how to do that here at the start. I know a lot of people can't follow along, but you can buy a sloper pattern. Once you make a muslin, make that fit you, then once you have a basic bodice block as well, then you too can follow along with me when I'm doing things like this. So if you guys are interested, let me know. Are you interested in a from scratch how to draft a bodice block video? There are already videos like this from people who are honestly more experienced and are actual teachers, but more experienced than I am here on the internet. They have plenty of people out there teaching you how to do this. So if you just search how to draft a bodice block or flat pattern drafting from scratch, there are going to be tutorials that come up that might honestly explain it better than I can. But if you guys want me to make a video on how to draft a bodice block, how to make a bodice block from a commercial pattern, let me know in the comments below and I'll see when I could possibly schedule that in. It is a bit more of an undertaking. But again, I digress completely from what we're doing today. Today I'm making a white cotton gathered neckline little 40s button back blouse, and I just, thought you might want to come along and make one with me. So I will be detailing the process today. Let's get started with that pattern. Okay, so here is the big problem with making sewing videos, is that my studio has pretty low ceilings. We're in a basement, so I can't really get too high up off of the surface where I am making stuff, but I will do my best to film and make this still clear. Basically, these two pieces of card here, this is my bodice block pattern. So this is my standard starting place, bodice front, bodice back. So the back has a single dart here, as you can see. This line is the center back, so this is a little bit of extra here, just as seam allowance for putting a zipper in, for example. This is a pretty tight neckline here because this is just to trace, and then we will modify it for whatever we're going to be doing. This is the front. This one has 2 darts here, as you can see. This curve is pretty sharp, or I don't know, you can see this one's a much more gentle curve, and a gentle curve is possible on the front as well if you don't have a double D, but in my experience, when you're dealing with a larger bust, having a larger side dart and interesting shaped armhole is what ends up happening. But, or at least that just has worked for me. I know everyone probably encounters different situations when it comes to fitting them, but this is the pattern that fits me. A lot of my dresses are made based on this pattern, and by a lot I mean all of them. This is actually also a basic sleeve pattern that just fits into this bodice. So like this together would create a very basic dress with a set-in sleeve, essentially. But we're going to be using my basic bodice block pattern today and this sleeve pattern, my basic sleeve pattern, to draft the blouse pattern or the top pattern that I will use to make this top today. Well, today and the rest of this week, obviously. Let's be honest, I'm probably not going to finish this tonight. But the shirt we are making is going to be something like this. So this is just a little blouse with a button back, like how you get in and out of it, basically. It's just going to have a little bit of a puff sleeve, and then you can see here, these are from the waist up. We have single darts here in the front. So if we look at our bodice pattern here, we have this dart is still here, the single dart here, but this dart is not on our little drawing. So what we're going to do is use this fullness, and we're going to transfer it up here into the neckline so that we have neckline gathering. So a dart, it is pinching fullness out of a area. So this is controlling fullness, basically. And what we're going to do is, instead of pinching it out here, we're going to gather it up here. Anytime you have darts, I'll show you, you can close them and move them. So if you wanted to, these two here meet at the point called the apex, sort of like the nipple of your pattern here. So where these two darts meet, you can spring out from there anywhere you want. So if I wanted to move this dart into the armhole, I could, and that's how you create a princess seam eventually. If I wanted to move this dart down here, if I wanted to move it up through the neck, if I wanted to, up into the shoulder, wherever you can swing this fullness off of the mid, like the bust point, the apex, anywhere you want. And you can close this one and leave this one if you wanted to. So darts really make, I like pattern drafting with darts. I think it's quite fun. It's like a little puzzle. So I will show you how we move this dart into fullness up here so we can achieve this single waist dart and then fullness gathering at the neckline here. In the back, it's just still, we're maintaining that single dart at the waist, and then just adding this button back. So we'll just add some excess here that we can play with to make a little sort of plackety fold over facing thing going on the back so that we can do these buttons. I'm not going to do anything super fancy for the placket because I don't care, because I'm kind of lazy, basically. I think I can't decide if I wanted to do like bias binding at the neck or if I just wanted to do facings, and I might end up doing both. So I might actually do a facing in here, which I'll show you how to draft that from this, and then also do a bias binding as well. It'll be a very clean finish, and a little bit bulky, so I can't decide what I want to do yet, so we'll decide on that later. But as for now, this is what we're making, and this is what we are using. So the first step here is going to be, we'll work on the front here first, and what we're going to do first here is just trace this bodice block here. So I'm just going to trace our basic front here, and then I will come back to you. So all I have done here is just trace my bodice front pattern here. So you can see I've just traced this guy on here and then copied any like really necessary information. But I've got my darts here just as they are on my pattern here. This guy just has little holes poked through. This is a 1/2 inch in, and then also at the little dart points so that I can transfer the darts onto the paper that I'm using. This is actually alphanumeric drafting paper, but you can use any paper you want, of course, to do pattern drafting on. Newspaper, even if you don't mind the distraction of not lots of nonsense going on. So I've just made a trace here, basically. I should also note that these sloper bodice block, usually like in fashion design school, for example, They did not have seam allowance on them, I don't think. I don't remember what the standard was. But for me, this includes seam allowance. So I never have to add it unless I'm making a cut into the thing itself. Like if I just decided to like make a little panel here for some reason, I would have to add seam allowance to that. But this, as it on its own, already includes the seam allowance as part of the pattern. So I don't have to worry about adding it unless I need to add it, which, again, nice and confusing. But basically this already has seam allowance, which means that this already has seam allowance. Now, what I have done here is I've just drawn a line through the center of both of my darts, up through the center of my darts, and this point where they meet here, because like your dart legs, or my darts end not at the apex, of course, but, and if you did want to end them at the apex, that's how you end up with that Anne Hathaway situation from many years ago. So if you want a very pointy bust, you can make your darts go all the way to the apex. But if you want to maintain some sort of less of a fetish look, you want to have this area still be kind of rounded. But we're going to use this point where these two darts meet as our point where we pivot this dart close and put the fullness up into the neckline here. But before we do that, I want to modify this neckline a little bit, because on a block or a sloper, you're going to want to have your neckline as high as possible. So like this would be a quite tight, high neck, like be right quite close to my neck. That's just because it's a starting point. So if I wanted to draw in a V neckline, if I wanted to draw in some sort of a square or a sweetheart neckline, I could. But basically I'm just going to lower this curve a little bit just so that it's a little bit more comfortable. If we imagine here, this is a shoulder seam. This is where your sleeve will be set in. So here's as we stand, just having traced it and then found our apex point. I will show you how we are going to close this little guy and then open it up over here. We just hinge it open, so I'll show you that in just 1 second. What I've done here at the top of our bodice pattern is I've just drawn in, first of all, I cut it out. What I've done is I just drawn a new neckline in, so I just lowered it about 5/8 of an inch here, and then almost probably a full inch in the center front here. So that's just coming off a little bit from the neck, so it's not as tight up there, which I just don't want it to end up being uncomfortable. So hopefully that will be enough. After you do this enough times, you start learning, you know, where your necklines are. Another good idea too is if remembering this is like the nipple or apex point. So if you imagine that is like the level in the bust, you can imagine how low the neckline is. So like this is probably a good point for a V. You wouldn't want your V neck to be like in the middle, unless you want to have a super plunge. You wouldn't go like down this far. So basically you can kind of imagine if this is the top of your neck and this is the like mid bust point, you can kind of envision where your neckline will fall in between those. So I'm just going to cut a pretty high neckline still, but just not as tight, so it's still a little bit more comfortable. To put this dart fullness, and stick it up here, how we're going to start doing that is I'm going to take my handy dandy clear ruler here, and I'm just going to go in the middle, sort of, I guess, middle to front side of my neck, and I'm just going to draw a line from that apex point up to the neckline here. And then we will cut both along that line, but not through this point, and then out through the middle of our dart, but not through that point. So I'll show you that in a moment. So I've just drawn from our point here to one of my dart legs over on this side, and I've drawn from this apex point up into the neckline as well, and then I will cut those. Okay, so now here we have our pattern. I have those two lines I just drew, and they are slashed or cut. This method of moving the darts around is actually usually called slashing and spreading, and you will see why, because we have slashed. And now what I'm going to do is spread this open by closing this dart. So because I cut here along this dart edge, basically I just want to move that fullness somewhere else. So if this is not cut all the way through here, you can see it's like hinged a little bit. So I'm just going to fold this up to close this dart. So I'm folding from this bottom of this dart edge. I'm just going to swing it to close that. And then I will just tape this shut. And as you can see, that opens, that fullness here has been moved up here into the neckline. So then we will adjust that in just a moment. But First, I'm going to go ahead and tape this line down. Okay, so now I have this taped shut. So our little dart that was here is gone, and that fullness has been moved up here into the neckline. I'm just going to take a piece of scrap paper here and tape this down so that we can work on the neckline a little bit here and smooth things out a bit. See from the piece I cut off here that this is what our neck used to look like. So this line, this curve has become really distorted. I'm sure there's an official way to connect these two things for when you're gathering it. I just kind of, make it so. I'm not too fussed. I've never had trouble doing it this way. But, I guess since we're going to be official today, I will consult the pattern drafting book that I always like, and we'll see what they say to do. But in my estimation, I kind of just usually do that. And we'll use maybe this curve. Maybe we should have made a facing first before I did this. Anyway, I'll use this curve if I decide to do a facing here instead of doing bias binding. But I think we're going to go the bias binding route anyway. So, designing on the fly here as I go, which is probably not the best for when I'm supposed to be teaching, but I'll look up and see what the official way to do this is, and I'll show you that as well. All right, so the only really reference I can find to a similar technique here is you can see that they've moved all the fullness, even including these two darts here, have been moved all up into this neckline area. And they just say, what does it say? Smooth, blend, blend. So basically that's what we're doing over here. We're blending these lines here so that when we gather it, it will go together as planned. But the recommendation here, it seems to be blend. And for those of you who wonder what pattern drafting book I have used ever since I got it for my college classes back in university, this is Pattern Making for Fashion Design by Helen Joseph Armstrong. I highly recommend this book. It's never led me wrong. A lot of the things in here I have not used because I don't often, I'm not usually making super complex things, but it'll teach you how to do collars, built-up necklines, kimono sleeves, different how to make a proper shirt with plackets, pockets, etc., collars, how to do all this dart manipulation stuff we're doing right now, and then designing trousers, swimwear, all the different. It has recommendations on how to do all of these things. So if you are interested in getting into pattern drafting, I highly recommend this book. It's never led me astray. I really like it. There's a lot of anything you could possibly want to do. If the internet isn't explaining it properly, I think this book could do it for you. This is the book that I was instructed to use in school. They just have some fitting information here at the top for how you carry your shoulders, how the body is shaped, different kinds of collar or shoulder, different types. And so it does have some recommendations for fitting, which again is something I haven't had to do a lot of because when I was in school, we were fitting on these. So we were fitting on dress forms. So my practice is fitting the standard form, which is standard, and therefore any measurements in this book apply very well to this, and then fitting myself, and those are the only types of shapes I have fit. So that's why I don't have a ton of experience. But if you do have issues, books like this and also the internet at large are going to be able to help you fit what you want properly, basically. So this is a really great book. Here's drafting the sleeve from scratch using measurements of your pattern. So I really recommend this book if you're interested in learning to do pattern drafting or just stepping up your sewing room supplies in general. It is more of an investment, I'm sure, because it is a textbook, but I think it's totally worth it. So now that I have blended this, I'm just going to go ahead and cut that out as well. I've just turned this over. As I'm going along, I do like to just tape down the backs too, because the front, it's all taped nicely, but I just feel like this starts catching on stuff and getting in the way. So I do like to tape down the back a little bit as well as I go. Now our pattern is looking a little bit like this. We've closed our dart here, opened up the gathering fullness there. We still have our bottom dart here. Now you could make this into a double-ended dart if you wanted to. I just usually close these darts and then leave from the waist down, sort of, it just becomes like a little pleat, because I'm never going to wear a blouse like this untucked. Actually, you can see there's a blouse very similar hanging just here. And you can see how that is. It's like a dart and then it hangs open as a little pleat after that. I always wear these tucked in. I always wear my skirts and my pants at my waist because it's how vintage is. So I never worry about really what things look like from the waist down, to be honest. And I don't make them very long because I'm just tucking it into my skirt or making it long enough to tuck in, basically, is the extent of what I'm doing there. So I have actually taped on a little bit of extra paper here. This is our original side seam of this bodice drawn onto here. I will be adding a tiny bit of ease through here in the waist and just kind of adding a little bit of a flare down here. So if we imagine this is the waistline of my, like where my natural waist is, I'm just going to create a little bit of a flare here so I have a little bit of shirt to tuck in the end. Okay, so for our side seam here, I've just added, I think it's like a little over 1/4 inch. So I've added about a centimeter here of space just for a little bit more ease because this is a blouse instead of a dress bodice. So you can have a little bit more ease in there just for comfort, I guess, or just because shirts usually have a little bit more ease. I don't know. I don't particularly like ease. I don't use a lot of ease in my sewing, you'll notice. But that's just because years of practice have taught me what I can and cannot do and how I like things to fit. So, but this is, imagining this is my waist point at the side. I've just added a little bit there and then I've just flared out a bit so that, because if we imagine this is where my hips are going to be, this is my waist and my hips come out from there. Let's be honest, I'm quite an hourglass. So I just have flared that a little bit. I've just gone 3 inches from the waist, 3 inches from the waist. This point is just because of how darts work. So about 3 inches from here, 3 inches from here. So I basically just marked 3 inches down from here, from here, from here, and then blended that line together. And so I will just cut this out now and we will see what our finished front piece looks like. Okay, so we have our finished front bodice or top, shirt, blouse pattern here. Basically, we've moved this dart, we moved the fullness up here into the neckline, and then we've closed the side one, added a little bit of ease here, and then a little bit of an extension just to tuck in. This dart here will close, and then this will create a dart above the waistline and then pleat again. Conveniently, the shirt sitting just here, showing us what that will look like at the end. This is a very slippy rayon, and I really do like the color of that top, but the neck is actually too tight because I didn't lower it enough when I was doing this. So the neckline of that top I need to fix somehow because it's too tight and it hurts to wear it. I can wear it, but not for extended periods of time. But this is our front for our little top that we're making here. So this will eventually look like this. And now I will go ahead and make the back as well. And then I will show you, I'll trace it and do everything basically because we don't have to do very much from the block to get to here. So I will just go ahead and make this pattern piece and then I will tell you what I did basically. All right. All right. Okay. So I've just go ahead and used our bodice back, trace that onto here. I'm just going to use the front pattern I made, line up the side seam here, line up the original side seam with the traced one here. So line up the original here and up there, and then I just traced the extension I added on basically. So I traced that little extra bit we have taped on to the front. I put that same thing onto the back. Again, I just added on a little bit of an extension. I made it about 4 inches in the center back as opposed to 3 inches in the front, just because the back I feel like needs to be more access to tuck in. I don't know. That's because I said so. That's why. And I just, again, smoothed that line here from the 3 inches at the side because I can modify the center back because it doesn't interact with anything other than itself. But the side seam, of course, I need to match up when I sew these two things together, the front and the back. So I need this to be the same, essentially. So this is going to be the same extension at the side as I did on the front. And to that end, also up here, because we changed the front neckline, this shoulder seam of the front will eventually be sewn to our shoulder seam of the back. So in order to change our neckline back here, this is how, see that's the armhole there, that's the armhole here. So this is how the front and the back are going to connect. So I'm going to connect this here, or draw a little line here, and that will be my guide so that this shoulder seam matches up on the front and the back eventually when we are sewing this together later. So this is a good way to make sure you draw, if you're going to modify your neckline, make sure that the shoulder seam is the same length. So match up the shoulder seam where it will be sewn together, and then just draw in a guide for your neckline for the back. And then I'll show you what we're going to do about adding excess for the buttons down the back of the blouse. So again, I've just drawn on a new curve for our back neckline here. I used this as my guide, lining this up to find out where I needed to make the neckline come out at the shoulder to match what I did in the front here. So I marked this point, and then I just came down about 1 inch in the back because I want this to have a pretty high back up here. And then you can, I just eyeball these curves and I kind of just sketch them in. You can use something like a French curve ruler. Hello, it's me from school here. To draw these curves in if you want. The French curve ruler like this is going to be a really good investment for if you're going to start doing pattern drafting. It helps obviously with things like the arm holes as well. Usually an armhole, like this is designed for doing clothes, so there's a reason that that nearly matches up perfectly, because standard patterning is very similar. Not that people are very similar shapes, but if you're from the starting point, a lot of times the curves are quite similar. So getting yourself a French curve like this, I'm sure you can get them online. Most fabric stores, craft stores will have rulers like this, so it's pretty good and handy to have around. Also, my other favorite ruler for doing pattern drafting are these clear rulers. I was so happy when I got, because I studied here in America, or the US, I studied patterning here, and I also studied in England, and I also studied in France. So I actually did find this exact same ruler, but only in metric when I was studying in Europe. So that was useful because I'm used, of course, to imperial. So imagine trying to do, like, learn how to do pattern drafting in imperial and then going and trying to do it all using centimeters and metric for the, next time. Everyone's like, did you do a centimeter seam allowance? I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. Instead of a ½ inch, it's a centimeter over here. But, that was a fun challenge. I actually did find the same ruler in metric, so I know that they do offer these in both imperial and metric. So really handy to have just so you can see through it like that and see, adding seam allowance and things like that. It's really quite useful. So these are your two most basic rulers for doing pattern drafting, the ones that I use the most. So and they're both relatively inexpensive, so that's nice as well. So I have the back piece cut out here now so we can see mostly what it looks like. Again, this dart will just do the same thing like that here on the back. So I'll just close this dart from the waist up, and then it will just hang free from there because it will be tucked in. So these are the buttons I'm going to be using for this top. And so if you imagine you want your garment to close, like if you had a zipper, this is where the center back would be. So I want it to close along the center back. So the buttons eventually will be sewn along the center back, which is this line here. So I want the rest, the side that has the button holes, to come out a certain amount from there as well. And this is actually not such a bad spot. And like, let's say you had smaller buttons, you would need less of an extension or from the edge basically. Or if you were using rather large buttons, you would want perhaps more excess or overlap essentially. So I will go ahead. These are, I don't even know, 5/8 buttons? Probably says somewhere. 3/4 of an inch buttons. So basically, if this is along the center line, I don't want the shirt to end right there. I would rather there be a little bit of excess. And so I'm going to create basically a certain amount of extra fabric to fold under and finish this edge. So I will explain that after I have it drawn on in just a second. The huge, giant, like major, in case of emergency, weapon scissors I'm using right now, they are PGM, which is also who makes those nice dress forms, that I would like to have one again. I did actually have a PGM dress form for a little while, but it wasn't my size, so I ended up selling it. But don't use fabric scissors on paper, in case you're new to this thing. Make sure you use scissors. You don't have to use ridiculous pattern drafting scissors like this that, again, are so heavy you could knock someone out if they ran into your sewing room. You don't need giant ones like this. Shorter blades like this are easier to cut curves with, which is why they make them this way. But just make sure you have a separate pair of scissors for paper and for fabric, just because because paper will dull the scissor faster than the fabric will. So you want to make sure you reserve your scissors for fabric separately, just to avoid snagging and sadness later. So everyone knows the pain of someone borrowing your scissors and cutting like cardboard with your fabric scissors, and then you have to go get them sharpened. Any longtime seamstress knows this pain, unless they live alone, in which case, congratulations. That's just a note on scissors while we're here. But basically what I have done here is I've just drawn on where our button is going to go. It's going to sit right on that center back seam. Again, you could add some ease if you wanted this to be looser. I want my things to fit quite tightly, so I don't add ease. So here's where our button is. I'm hoping that the end of the garment is along here. So like this line here, which is 3/4 of an inch out from my center back, that's where the finished edge of my fold over will be. So this is going to be, look like this in the end, basically. So I need to have this edge finished some way. So I'm leaving this excess here so that I can fold it over. So you can do this so you can fold it over like a little bit like that and then finish it. But I'm just going to serge this raw edge and have this down like this, and then I will have my buttonholes here. So you want to make sure that, actually this is not enough. So this is a good discovery. Because I can see through the paper here, if I imagine that my buttonhole is going to be this length of this button here, it's going to be right on the edge of that fold over I just did. So I just guesstimated like 1.25 inches. But folding it over, I can see that I'm going to need another 1/2 inch maybe to have enough fold over that the buttonhole will go through the entire little facing I'm making here by having that fold. So I will add another bit onto here and we'll come back. Where I'm at now is I have just taped on a little bit more extra here, and then I've decided to just fold it along where I want that finished edge to be so I can see how far I want my facing to come out, basically. We imagine our button will go here, so the buttonhole is going to go across this full like distance of this, at least of the button, if not a little larger. So our buttonhole is going to come out to here. I want to have some sort of a cushion from the buttonhole out. So, you know, here is where I'm going to cut this line so that the fold over not only gives us this finished edge, but like I have room for it to be serged on the inside and have plenty of space between the end of the buttonhole and the end of the facing that this will eventually be. This will make a lot more sense when we're sewing later, and I'll be showing you all this process. Of course, only one side needs to have a facing this thick, because for like the buttons going to be sewn here, you don't need to have this much excess on the side where the buttons are sewn. Like, you can definitely have it much smaller. But we're just going to leave it like this for now for the pattern and cutting, because I'll show you how all this kind of comes together, the buttons, everything in the back. Buttons and buttonholes come together in the back in the sewing part of this. But for the pattern, for pattern making sake, I'm just going to make sure that this extends out far enough to here once it's folded over, basically. So I will cut that and show you. Okay, so you can see how this swings up. Like, this was the center back, it's usually straight, but this like swings up now. That's because when it eventually is folded over, it will now be nice and smooth with the rest. So I added on that back to the little triangle. But so basically that's just it's like having a separate facing, but there's no reason to cut along here and sew it separately, just when you can have it as a fold over. So I'll just have this fold over in the back. This edge will be serged to finish it, because this isn't a couture garment. I don't need to do like rayon seam binding or anything fancy. It's just a cotton shirt. So I will just serge along this edge here, and that will finish that for the back. And we'll eventually, when we're sewing this, we'll see how that looks. But here we are. Here's our finished back pattern piece, and we have our finished front pattern piece here. So we have the front and back of our blouse, but what about our sleeve? So I do still need to make a sleeve pattern. This is my standard sleeve pattern, which means it's going to be a smooth cap up here, but I am going to show you how I make this into a puff sleeve. So I will add some fullness up here at the top. So I will show you how I do that. Focus. So what I've done here is this is just our sleeve, my standard sleeve pattern that I've traced. I'm going to make these a little bit shorter, just because this is like almost elbow length at this point, or almost to like the top of my crook of my arm. So I'm going to make this a little bit shorter, but I've just drawn a line down the center of the sleeve here from the shoulder point, and then I've just gone out 3 inches either side, and I'm just going to add a little bit of fullness in here by slashing and spreading once again, just to the sleeve cap. So if I cut along this line completely and just open it up and put in 1 inch here, that means that the edge of the bottom edge of the sleeve will also have excess, and we don't want that. So we just want there to be extra fullness in the cap in the top of the sleeve. So if we're looking at this, we want a little bit of puff up here, but we don't need anything extra going on down here at the bottom. So to do that, I will cut through these lines, spread them each 1 inch probably, I would say, and then I will smooth, adding a little bit up here, smooth that line back out. So I will show you what that looks like and talk you through it. Okay, so if we imagine we have our sleeve cut out here now, and I've cut along those lines, but again, not through this point here. So you can add like a massive amount of puff, or you can add some. It just depends on how gathered you want that little top of your sleeve to be. I'm probably going to put in 1 inch in each of these junctions, so it's like 3 extra inches of floof. And then I will make it a little bit higher up here too. That just gives it room for that volume. So I will go ahead and add another piece. I just left that piece there so you could see against the blue really well. But I will add in some extra paper, and then I will tape it so it has an inch between each spot here, and we will have a new, and I'll smooth this edge a little bit, smooth that edge a little bit, show you the finished puff sleeve basically. So now that I have spread and taped down each of these like about an inch here, and then I came up an inch from the center of the sleeve and then just smoothed that back into the line. All this gathering is going to be contained, you know, in the top part of our sleeve here. So I don't want it to be gathered down here by the arm, you know, under your arm. That would be uncomfortable to have fabric gathered down there. So I want to keep this gathering concentrated in the center top portion of the sleeve. So that's why that's all up in here. And then like on, if you were to look at like a commercial pattern piece, usually there would be a guideline that was like from here to here is where you want to keep your gathering, is like in this section here. So we will, I mean, I don't care enough to be that precise when I'm doing my own stuff for myself, but I guess this time we will mark this with a pin when we are cutting out our pieces, and I will actually properly keep my gathering in check. Usually I just eyeball it because I've just been sewing for so many years that I feel I don't usually use notches, you'll notice, or a lot of indicators or markings. The thing I do is I do still draw my dart legs in because I just don't, I'm lazy. So that one I do still cheat, but everything else I kind of just wing it, which I know is scary if you're new to sewing, but for me, I've been doing this a long time. So for me, imagining just keeping the gathers at the top, that's not scary to me. But again, we'll show you how exactly I go about doing those when we get to the sewing portion of this. The bottom hem of this the curve isn't that extreme, so I'm not even going to bother to like draw in a new curve. It's very subtle, so I'm not gonna worry about it. This is a not very much puff to add. You could go much. You could spread this much more. And in fact, in that book I was using earlier, the instructions in there, they have you add like 2 inches and like 2 inches, a lot more puff. But I didn't want a crazy puff sleeve. This isn't the 1980s. We're making a 40s blouse, not an 80s blouse, so I didn't go too crazy. So just a little bit of puff here in our sleeve. So that's how I would modify my standard set-in sleeve pattern to be a little bit of a puff sleeve for this blouse we're making. Okay, so there you have it. That's how I use my standard bodice block pattern, or how I would use my standard bodice block and sleeve pattern to draft something like this. So once I have an idea, I usually sketch out my ideas, even though it's not completely necessary, but usually I'll sketch them out. This is kind of more like a text sketch than it is a fashion sketch. In fashion design school, at least, they had us do like very artsy, like flowy, really exaggerated, like almost, you know, pretty sketches that I found useless because I want to know what's happening. And for me, a technical sketch, something more like this, is more useful than like a croquis or a fashion design sketch that you'll see sometimes, like Karl Lagerfeld, for example. Sketches, they look very pretty, but I can't tell as a seamstress what the heck I'm supposed to do, or like where you want the darts or whatever. So my sketches are somewhere in between fanciful and text sketch, but they definitely lean heavily on technical sketch side of things. So I will sketch something out. I will take my bodice block pattern. I will make the pattern I need to use. And then of course now I can use this as many times as I want. If I wanted to change the neckline again or something, I could, but usually I'll just, like, you know, make a pattern like this. I put them in baggies. I will just, like, this just says bodice patterns. This is basically the same pattern as this, but with different necklines. So if I want to make a V-neck dress, I just come in here, grab the V-neck bodice from last time, slap a skirt on it, and call it a dress. So I have different bags of different pattern pieces. So for example, I would take a baggie, say gathered, like puff sleeve, gathered neck, button back blouse, and put that in there, and then I can use it again and again and again whenever I want to make a button back, gathered neckline, sleeve blouse. And that's kind of how I've built up my, like, I don't usually have to draft a new pattern every time I want to make something because I have bags of them ready to go. So usually I'll just choose what sleeve I want, choose which bodice I want, and choose which skirt, and then ready to go. So once you've built up a bunch of patterns, you can kind of mix and match them like Lego almost, and just like put which sleeve you want with which bodice and neckline and which skirt. So it's very much, you just put them together and away you go. But this is going to be our pattern for this project. So that's why I'm thinking this video is going to be quite long, because, you know, going through how I made the pattern, we're already here and we still have to make it. So I'm going to go actually have a break, and I'm going to go make dinner personally. But you guys, it'll just be a few minutes and I'll be back. Alrighty, so I have my lovely fabric laid out here so we can cut this little project out here. So I'm just going to, of course, put this front piece along the fold here in the front, and I will just pin that, and then the back I'm just going to have below it here, and then I just have the sleeve sort of fits up here, so I'm just going to stick that on the cross grain like that. I don't think it'll make too much of a difference here, so I'm just going to go ahead and pin these pieces and then cut this little project out. Sadly, we cannot play the Kyoko while I am filming. Anyway, so I have our lovely white little floral, like embroidered faux eyelet stuff. Check, all cut out. I've got our sleeves and the front and the back here. So this is all I'm actually going to do for tonight. I'm actually going to check out of the sewing room for the day, and then I will come back tomorrow and continue working on this with you guys. We are back. This is day 2 of making the white eyelet but not eyelet blouse. I have gone a little bit epic with the eye makeup today. I was inspired by like blue butterflies. I was trying to figure out how to use this turquoise color in a way that I would find exciting. So yeah, I may have played with eyeshadow for too long this morning. But now, before lunch here, I'm going to take out the pins since I cut everything out for the blouse yesterday, or the top. And so I'm going to take out the pins now, and then we're going to serge, and by we, I mean me, I'm going to serge the raw edges of the pieces just so that they're ready to go and we can start sewing. So here's everything cut out. I'm just going to go ahead and take these pins out, and then I will go ahead and, tripod's in the way here, just serge the raw edges. I've got white thread set up on here luckily, so I'm just going to go around all the edges basically and serge the raw edges so that they are finished, and I won't have to worry about finishing my seams any other way basically. Alright, so now I have the edges of my pieces serged. I've just pinned my sleeves together at the underarm just so I can sew those at some point here. But now I'm going to basically mark the darts here on our pattern pieces onto my pieces. You can do this with a, we have markers where the ink becomes invisible after a minute or like washes out. There's chalk. There's like just using chalk pencils, just using pins and eyeballing it. Usually I will use like a chalk pencil or a colored pencil. I don't really care if the inside of my garments have lines. Usually I'm using a more opaque fabric than this. This is a pretty sheer fabric, so I will be quite delicate with my little markings today. This is, again, one of the areas where I do kind of cheat. I will go ahead and just transfer the darts, the legs of the darts even onto my fabric, because I find that's just like the fastest and easiest way to sew darts. Some people just eyeball it, but I'm not one of those people. So let's transfer those markings onto the fabric. So I've just laid my pattern piece out on the inside of the front piece here. Of course, the front was cut on the fold here, so the front doesn't have a seam down the middle or anything, but this piece is just laid onto one side of the front. And I'm just going to poke holes on my darts using an awl, which looks like this, which is a little tool to poke holes in just about anything, leather, paper, fabric, whatever you want. But I just used it to poke holes in my little dart legs here and in the point of the dart. And then I will just transfer those points onto my fabric. And then I will have, which of course gets totally lost here in the print, but if you can kind of see, there's a pencil mark there and here and here. So it gets quite lost in this print very easily, but I will go ahead and connect those dart legs a little bit, just with not a graphite pencil, but with a little color pencil. I find on white or ivory items, if I use either like a light yellow or a light blue pencil or chalk, it really doesn't show very much. Even on something this year, I shouldn't be marking it at all unless I'm using invisible ink, but I am lazy, so I'm going to. Them's the facts, guys. Them's the dirty truths. So I'm not sure you can even see here, but I have drawn my dart legs. I've connected the points with this light green pencil here. Again, this is something that a lot of people would tell me I'm very wrong to do, but that's just how I do it, and I don't care if it's wrong, if it works. On the other side, I can't see anything, so that's just how I do it. I will now go ahead and pin these, and I will show you that. So here are my darts all pinned. I basically just, pinched the fullness here, matching up each dart leg, matching up these points, making sure my pins go through the same part on the line on the front and the back here. And then I will just go ahead and start here and sew these darts shut. But I will toss this. This is the front. So I'll toss this down here by my machine, and then I will pin the backs using the same method for the darts on the back. Here we are at my machine. I just have a pretty standard stitch length. I haven't really messed with anything. The needle's just lined up with the mark on the presser foot here. If you move some dials on your machine, you can move the needle, just in case those of you who are real new to a machine. So I'm basically just going to be sewing along that line I naughtily, illicitly drew. So I'm just going to be sewing. This is at the bottom, like the fat end of the dart, if you imagine the triangle of the dart. Then I will just sew off the point of the dart up here. I will remove these pins as I go, but I'm just going to start down here. So use a little bit of back stitch here at the start to secure my thread. Sew along that dart leg, so right off the edge here, and then I will tie the threads shut. That's just how I do my darts. So I'm going to go ahead and sew the darts for this project here. Okay, so while I was sewing the darts on the front and back pieces, I also just went ahead and sewed that seam on the sleeves. So here are my sleeves as they are now. These pins here, there's one on each side here, that's indicating the front side of the sleeve. So it will go on my arm like this. So the back has no pin, the front has a pin. That's just so I don't get mixed up and have to keep pulling out the pattern piece as I go. So I just leave a pin in the front side of the sleeve so I don't get confused, but we'll just put those aside for now. I will want to iron this seam open, so I will plug in the iron here because I don't actually have it on right now. But we can see here this is the front piece. Our darts are now sewn. So you can see that little triangle of fabric here. And I mean, you can tack them down if you want to, but I just leave them like this. You can also iron them open like this, and that gives like a very cute little box pleat effect in the front. But again, it's just going to be tucked in anytime I wear this, so I'm just gonna leave it like this. I won't have any trouble doing that, but I will go ahead and iron these. So let me turn on the iron here. Yes, this is how messy my sewing room is. And like, look, illegal plastic straws and everything down here. Who knows what's going on? Lots of fuzzies from projects past. But I'm gonna go ahead and plug in the iron and get that ready to go so that I can just iron these darts, and then I will break for lunch. Okay, you guys, so I have my darts all ironed. Now what I'm gonna just do is put the gathering stitches in for this front piece while it's still nice and flat before I start sewing it to the side or the back side pieces. So I just have my pattern piece here. I'm just going to lay that out along the shoulder seam, match this basically up where it belongs. So this is the fullness we moved here into the neckline. So basically this is the point where the gathering at the neck begins. I'll use this fullness and here and gather all this area, but I just want to make sure I mark a point here so that no gathering is up here beyond like this point basically. So I'm just going to keep the gathering concentrated in the center front of the neck here. So I'm going to put a pin here and then again on the other side after I flip this to find the other side, and then I will explain what I'm going to do for gathering the neck. So now I have a pin on either side here. This is the center front right here. These are the shoulder seams here of the front piece. So I'm just going to put 2 lines of stitching here on a big stitch length, so like a 4, the largest stitch length that my machine does. So large stitch length here so that I can gather this area. I'm going to want to gather it to this measurement. So essentially all this fullness will be incorporated here at the neckline. So I'm going to, so twice this is what the entire gathering will be. That probably doesn't make much sense, but I will show you once I have this gathered and you will see what I mean. All right, so let me put those 2 lines of gathering stitches in. Basically, I'm just going to put them at like a 1/4 inch in from this area here. I'll just put those 2 lines of stitching. The reason you do 2 lines of stitching when you're doing machine gathering is because if one thread breaks, you don't lose all the work you've done up to that point. It's nice, and it just is nicer when you're gathering to have 2 threads, and I think you'll see why in a second. I've just lined up my piece of fabric here. This is the top edge there, and I've just turned my stitch length all the way to the largest length of stitch, and I'm not going to back stitch or anything here. I just have my fabric lined up with the edge of the presser foot here, so it's a little, probably under a 1/4 inch, and I will do my first line of stitching, and then I will go stitch again right next to that. So you can see here I have just 2 lines of stitching along this front neck area, and I've left the thread tails very long because we're going to use them to do gathering when it comes to that. We can, I guess I'll gather this in now. There's not really, you can do this now, or I could do this after I sew the rest of the blouse together. It doesn't really matter the order I do this in, but I'll just go ahead and gather these now and show you what that looks like when these are pulled to size. I realize I should show you exactly how I'm doing this for those of you who haven't gathered before. So this side I've just tied off the threads, so these are actually knotted now. So this side's not going to move. But this side, I'm just pulling the 2 threads from the top edge here. As you can see, these are the 2 threads on the top. Of course, there are the 2 that are on the bottom, just because of how a sewing machine makes stitches. And so I'm just going to pull on these 2 threads here, and that will be how we do our gathering. And I'll show you on the other camera. Maybe. So, just scooch this fabric along those threads. So now I have this gathered. I pulled these center section's tight. I've actually tied off this end as well because I double checked it against the pattern. What I did here is I just pinned that fullness we added closed so we can see what the original neckline we drew looks like basically. And so I'm just making sure that this, and if I imagine then this flips over, matches up with what we've done. So if I go along the center here, is the neckline close to what we drew originally, and we are there now. So now we have our gathering in. I will encase this top edge in a bias binding or a binding of some kind in the end here, but for now we're just going to leave this like this. I've tied off my ends so this gathering shouldn't move, and hopefully we won't get too violent while we're sewing the rest, that anything should happen to this. It should be fine just while we're chilling here while we finish the rest of the blouse here. So I'm just going to go ahead and lay the side seams together now. So I'm just going to make sure I have the right sides facing one another, so right sides together. I will sew along this side seam here and then along the shoulder seam at the top here. So I will pin those and then sew those for each side. So this is the back piece. I'm just laying that onto the front. Doesn't really matter laying the front on the back on the front, whatever. So I'm just going to match these side seams and shoulder seams up and sew those shut. Okay, so I have my side seams and my shoulder seams sewn together now. So I'm just going to go ahead and take these out and iron them open, basically. There is a subtle curve here along the side seam. I'm not going to clip this curve just because it is such a subtle one, and I'm just not worried about it fussing with it. So I'm not going to clip that curve. I know normally you do clip curves in sewing, and that is something that will add a more professional look to your finished project, but I don't want to have to finish anything in here. So I'm just going to leave that as it is and just iron these seams open. Okay, so now we have our top. It's looking like this so far. Again, we have those darts that open up into like little pleats down here. Our side seams are sewn. Our shoulder seams are sewn. We have the gathering up in the neck. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my sleeves from earlier. I'm going to put gathering stitches along the tops of the sleeve, just like I did on this neckline, and gather the tops of the sleeves before I set them into this armhole, basically. I'm actually going to hem the sleeves as well before I set them in. And actually, I mean, I could turn this twice. This fabric is a little bit bulky though, and I think I'm just going to turn this up once and actually going to machine stitch it. You could hand stitch this for an even finer finish, just like do a hem stitch or blind hem stitch or something like that. I'm just going to go ahead and machine stitch this because of this fabric being so busy and having so much stitching all over it already. Anyway, I think the stitches will be pretty lost in the pattern of the fabric, so I'm not too concerned about them being seen. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a machine stitched hem, probably about maybe an inch of a hem on this sleeve here, just to finish off that bottom edge, and then I'll do the gathering, and then the sleeves will be finished, and then I can set them into our top here. So I will go ahead and work on these sleeves, and then I'll give you an update. For turning this hem on the sleeve, I am just using a little hem gauge here. You can just set it to whatever like height you want, and then you can just use it to make sure you're going the same distance all the way around. So that's how I'm doing that. Then I'm just using pins to hold that shut, and I will go ahead and sew probably just along here next to the serging. So I will probably sew in like 3/4 of an inch in along this sleeve here and just put a seam around there to hold that hem shut. So if I look at my sleeves, I have those just hemmed now, as I was talking about. So I just turned that up an inch and stitched them down. So if I look at my sleeves, here is the center point of my sleeve here. And if I have them folded kind of along the center line, this is the underarm seam along the fold here. If I lay out my pattern piece, you can kind of see how the center line and the edge matches up just where my gathering fullness I added is. So it's kind of convenient for me because that means I'm just going to sew my gathering stitches along this curve basically. So I'm just going to go from here to here and do those 2 lines of stitching for the gathering again on both of these sleeves. So that really kind of worked out for me. I don't really get super particular about making sure my gathering matches exactly where my pattern piece says it should start. Like usually I just like gather the middle of my sleeves. I'm going to move the gathering to the middle of the sleeve anyway, so the gathering in the end will be only between like kind of up in here and concentrated again at the top of the sleeve. So that's what I'm going to do with these, and I will show you that. I have my top, my sleeve cap here gathered. I'm Just pulling on those stitches to get that little section of gathering up here, just like I did for the neckline. I didn't tie this end off, so this is still, I could pull the gathering out if I wanted to, so this end is still loose, and that's because I like to do a final sizing and adjusting of this gathering as I pin the sleeve into the top itself. So I'm going to start pinning this into the top, and then if I need to make any adjustments, pulling these gatherings around, giving myself a little bit more room, final sizing of the basically sleeve to fit into the armhole just so it fits perfectly. That's just how I do that. So I'm going to pin these into the shirt itself now, and I'll resize the gathering as needed as I do that. So here is the side seam, and that is pinned to the underarm seam of my shirt here, of the sleeve. So I just make sure I have both of these seam allowances open like that because they've already been pressed like that, but you just want to pin them. If you're going to pin, you might as well pin those open as well. Then of course the smooth bits are pinned all the way down, and then I just adjusted this gathering portion to fit my shoulder. So this is the shoulder seam of the top here, and so I just fit the gathering so there's an even amount of gathering over this section and on either side of the shoulder seam essentially. So that's just how that's going to fit in there, and I will go ahead and sew those sleeves on. Okay, so here is where we're at right now. I just popped on the dress form so I can show you guys basically what step of the process we're in, because sometimes it's hard to see what we're doing when it's all flat. So sleeves are on, nice and puffy. Got our gathering at the neckline still there. We have our darts in, everything's together basically. You can see how the puff sleeves are set in there. Our gathering still raw edge up there. So basically the next step in this process here is to make the fold over and the buttons and the buttonhole here in the back. Please ignore how messy my sewing room floor is. I need to sweep in here. But the sleeves are all done. So basically we're just going to finish this back and then we will finish the neck. So that's next. All right, so if we have the backs of the top here, and I take my pattern and lay this back on top of this back fold over area. So we know again, this is still the center back, and this is where I want this shirt to finish. So I'm going to put a pin right there and right down here. And since I know that's where I want the fold to be, and then I will just iron that fold into place. So on the inside, I've just folded this in along that line where I want the shirt to extend to. This is actually just 2 inches, so I just use this as a rule along here. And on both sides of the back, I just have this pressed like so, inside like that. So I will turn the shirt inside out and talk through exactly what we're going to do back here. Okay, so here's the top with the 2 back edges laying over one another. So it looks like from looking at a couple of vintage patterns, the correct way to do this is to have the buttonholes on the right hand side and then the buttons on the left side here. This technically, because I'll just be sewing the buttons to it, you can see how far that facing comes through. I can lessen this facing if I wanted to. Basically cut off another inch of here if I should so desire, basically, because it doesn't necessarily need to be this wide just to sew the button on over here. And I can't decide if I want to do that or not. I might just leave it as is so that it's the same on both sides. I think I'll do that. I'm just going to leave this as it is. So that it is just even on both sides. Because it is a little bit transparent, you will see that facing through here. I'll be wearing a cami underneath this, but up here, like on the top of my back, you'll be able to see that through here. And maybe I'll just keep it consistent with this so that it just has this wide band of white down the back. But so what's next here is I'm going to mark along this piece here where I want to put my buttonholes, and then I will sew the buttonholes on my machine using the buttonhole like stitches that come on my machine. It does have automatic buttonhole stitches on my machine, and that is what I will use to sew the buttonholes on here. Knowing that right here where these darts end is the waistline, I try and make sure I have a button just below or above this area that will sit like above my skirt waistband or tucked into my waistband and kind of help keep this area secured. I try to have one below that is a really like flat button. I'll use a different button. If I always plan on wearing these tucked in, which I do, I will use a like flatter button on the one button that goes where it will be tucked in, because I want it to keep it as smooth as possible. And then up here I'll use whatever buttons I want to. This time we're using these plain white buttons. Basically they'll pretty much blend in. But yeah, I'm just going to probably use, let's say, put a button every 2.5 inches. So I'll put one here at the top, and then I will go 2.5 inches down, 2.5 inches down, and space them out along the back here and kind of just decide. You don't want to have, like, obviously too far apart, you'll get gaping. Too close together, that's just more work. It's definitely a cute look to have lots of buttons. It takes more work to put it on, and it takes more work to do all those buttonholes. But if you should so desire to have lots of buttons, go for it. When you're sewing, you know, have fun. I'm just going to probably put 5 or 6 here along the back, and I will show you again after I have marked the buttonholes, essentially. So on my pattern, this fold line represents where this is ironed and folded here as well. And so 3/4 of an inch in from that is my actual center back, like the center back measurement where a zipper would be, where there's something with a zipper. So imagining that 3/4 of an inch in is where the actual center back is, that's where I want my buttons to line up along for this to fit me perfectly. So I'm going to put a little dot every 2.5 inches and 3/4 of an inch in, basically. So along the center back line, I've put a dot every 2.5 inches. And that's where my buttonholes are going to be. Now this dot represents the center back. So I want that to be in the middle of my finished buttonhole. So if I have my button, it goes in the middle of where that is. This is again to fit me quite closely. If you wanted more ease, you would, you could add a little bit more room. But again, I like my garments to fit quite closely, quite tightly. So I'm going to have this exactly along the center back, basically. You can make your buttonholes going this direction, parallel to this edge if you want. I put them perpendicular to the edge just because that's how I see it done on vintage blouses and on other vintage patterns. So I assume that that's the way it was done in the past because that's what I have seen from the materials I've seen. So I do it the way that those patterns seem to have done it, as opposed to some people have told me I should just do it this way, but I don't. I think this is how most shirts seems to work, is to have the buttonhole this direction, perpendicular to the fold. So that's how I'm going to do it on mine as well. So I will go ahead and use this button as a guide and draw the little lines that I will follow with my buttonholing stitch on my machine. I'm going to do that with a light yellow pencil because I do not want it to be seen. Again, use something with the disappearing ink. Use chalk instead. Use something that will wash away. Or if you're me, don't care. You know, basically is the moral of that story. I have these light yellow dots here, which shows how wide I kind of need to make my buttonhole. Of course, you want to make your buttonholes a little bit wider than your button, but not too big so it doesn't just slip out of that buttonhole. Just like a nice little snug fit. So I'm just going to start here, sew my buttonhole along here, and then go back. That's kind of how these work on the machine. And so I will make my buttonholes, and then I will cut them open, sew the buttons on, and then we'll be nearly done. We'll just have to finish the neckline and the hem, and then this top will be done. So this is kind of a nerve-wracking part because if the machine, while you're doing your buttonholes, decides to, act up, then it eats your nearly done project, and that's not very fun. So I do recommend whenever you're doing buttonholes on the machine to take, like for example, this is 2 layers of this fabric. I should test a buttonhole on a scrap piece of fabric with 2 layers like this first. You can actually put a piece of interfacing in here as well. This fabric is pretty thick with the stitching, so I don't feel like I need to add any more stiffening in here, but if you have a lightweight fabric, it's good to put some fusible interfacing or just any kind of interfacing or stiffener in here if you're going to be doing buttonholes, just because it can be hard on the fabric and is an area of stress on the garment as well, so it's good to have it supported more. But this, I feel like it's going to be just fine on its own, so I won't be putting any stiffener in there. And then this is not sewn down in any way, but when I do the buttonholes, it will kind of hold this facing down, and then it will be held in here. It'll be held at the hem. So I'm not going to do any line of stitching along that to hold that facing down or anything, because the buttons and buttonholes will do it just fine for me. So I was just doing some test buttonholes here on a little scrap piece as I recommended, and I'm noticing what's irritating is because there's so much stitching going on, it's hard to know what to seam rip in here. Everything just blends together really quickly. So it's hard to know which stitches are part of this design of the fabric and which stitches are part of the actual buttonhole stitch. So I think, I mean, either I could be super meticulous about this, or I could just use a different color thread for my buttonholes and have it just be subtly different. I don't really mind. This one is very close to white. It's like a light lavender. I think that one would blend in quite well. Then I, of course, could use like an ivory, which I don't know, I'm kind of leaning towards the lavender color. I think I'm going to choose this. And I think the buttonholes will still match quite well. They won't like stand out or be contrasty, but it'll stand out just enough that when I'm plucking them apart with the seam ripper, because you kind of sew a buttonhole and you rip the inside open, basically, when you're doing buttonholes this way, I guess. And I think so that I can see what the heck I'm doing when I do that and don't cut the wrong stitches, I'm going to switch to this really light lavender colored thread, just so that I can see what the heck I'm doing. So there's another thing, you know, on the fly change or decision, basically. So I'll practice with that on here and make sure that that will work for me. So just so you can see what that looks like, here, you can see over in the light. So the white thread obviously matches perfectly. This one is just a little bit darker. And obviously those yellow markings are from my pencil here. So I think I'm going to go with this lavender thread. Obviously you can see the difference here between the two, but I need to be able to see the difference, so I'm going to go with this lavender thread here for these. We're all done. Not my favorite part of the process, but you know, this, you can see here how my little yellow dots got covered in thread, so now you can no longer see them. That little pink dot in the middle there, of course, the button will sit on top of that, so I'm not really worried about any of my markings showing in the end. And I think that although I used that lavender thread as opposed to white, I think they blend in pretty well still, just because that white was going to make it really hard to cut them open. So I'm glad I chose to not use white thread for these and use that lighter pale lilac-y lavender color instead. So now I'm just going to, on the other side, mark and sew my buttons down so that we can have a functioning top here. All right, so I have my buttons sewn on now. Hooray! So I just sewed the buttons onto this side of the shirt, and now we have a functioning closure here in the back of my shirt here. So basically all that's left to do, because our sleeves are already hemmed from earlier, is attach a bias binding around the neckline here, and then do something about this hem. I think I'm just going to turn this little guy really slim underneath like that and just stitch along it, because again, I don't plan on wearing this without having it tucked in ever. So I'm just going to take this little serged edge, turn this under, and then stitch along that, and then I will show you what that looks like when it's finished. And then up here I made a strip of bias from this same fabric. I would love to have actually just like plain cotton that matched this, but not enough that I'm going to wait and go and buy some to do this, just because this is a little thick and for that reason irritating to work with, especially doing something fiddly like this. But I'm just going to iron this into a bias binding, seam binding like so, and then I will put that on to here. So I'll hem this first. That's going to be really fast, and then I will show you the process of putting this bias binding on the top neck edge here. Alright, so I just turned basically that serged edge along the bottom up and sewed it down. So we just have a very little narrow hem along the bottom edge now, and then just have to finish this top. So I've just taken a strip of bias that was 2 inches wide from my fabric, basically, just cut it from the same fabric. And remember, bias is just on that 45-degree angle of the fabric, basically. And then you just fold 1/2 inches in and then on itself and iron it down to create bias binding, just that matches your fabric, basically. So I'm going to take this little guy here and fold this out like this along the top edge and pin that all the way around, and then what we will, or I will, I keep saying we, and I know it's just me, but you're here with me, right? You're here with me. Moral support, thanks guys. So I'm just going to stitch or pin this all along this top neckline edge here, and I will sew that, and then I will show you how I will be finishing this up completely. Have that bias pinned all along the neckline now, and then I cut it so that there's a 1/2 inch extra to turn inside when I'm done here. So I'm just going to sew along in this little ironed ditch, basically 1/2 inch in from the edge, and then I will sew that, and then we will wrap the bias on the inside, and I will hand stitch to finish this down. Okay, so now I have the bias tape sewn onto this top edge of my neckline here. So I'm just going to turn this bias to the inside here, and I'm actually going to hand stitch this down. So turn this, hard to do one-handed, like so, with this folded inside as well, so we'll have a nice clean edge here, and this will just be along the top edge of the neck like that. And so I'm just going to do hand stitch this down inside here with some little hand stitches, because I find that easier than having to stitch in the ditch. I'll just hand sew it, and then this shirt will be done. Alright, so here is the front with that bias stitched down. I literally just came in here and did a little hand stitch to stitch this down on the inside, and so this is all finished up here at the neck now. Now, even though this is bias tape, it's bunching up just a little bit here, and because it is bias, it means there's a little bit of room in the angle of the fabric for that to kind of look a little bit better, basically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the iron and use a little bit of steam and just kind of coax this curve, and just kind of press this, maybe even using a tailor's ham here, which is what this is called because it looks like a ham. Adorable, I know. To just make sure that curve is as smooth as it can possibly be, just with a little bit of help from some steam here. And then it will be finished, and I will try this on for you and wrap up this video. Does this white, very feminine little blouse match my crazy eye makeup and like anime hairdo today? No. No, it does not. But, you know, this is, I was just playing with eyeshadow earlier and hanging around the house today, sewing, so I didn't look very retro. So we have a little bit of a dissonance between this finished top and the rest of my look today, but hopefully it's not too jarring. This blouse is of course now finished. Here it is, all done on me, and I'll put a clip of me modeling it for you as well. So hopefully this video was interesting for those of you who are interested in seeing a little bit more about my pattern drafting and sewing process. I tried to show as many steps as I could. If you do have any other questions about how I finished something or how I did something, or if I skipped a step, just feel free to ask away in the comments below, and I will answer any of your questions about this project or any other sewing needs you have. I'll try and answer your questions. I was trying to be quite detailed in this video, hopefully, because I only have this camera that I'm filming on now and my phone camera. So a lot of this was, I know, quite shaky phone camera footage. I hope that wasn't too bothersome. I'd love to get like some GoPros or things like that. I just don't have the capital to invest in that kind of thing just yet. So I don't really have the best of equipment for making full tutorial sewing style videos yet. But hopefully this was still insightful for those of you who wanted to learn a bit more about my pattern drafting and sewing process. So project number 1 from my sewing goals video is completed, which does make me feel good because that means I'm 25% of the way through my sewing goals for the summer already, because I only planned 4 projects, but you know. So yay, hooray, 1 project is done. Thank you all for sticking with me through this, I'm sure, very long video, and sticking with me through that project and shaky cam and all that. I'm happy with how this blouse came out. It came out just how I envisioned it, and I look forward to wearing it with all kinds of stuff because, of course, being white and rather neutral, it will match nearly everything in my closet, but not crazy makeup like this very well. But, you know, it's a bit of a mix, these two looks. It's alright. If it was black, maybe I could get away with it, but this is a bit of a too far. In any case, thank you all for watching today, and I will see you again soon. Bye. I look ridiculous. This is not I would not pair this hair and makeup with this blouse. I'm looking in the viewfinder, and it's a no from me. This is not an ideal combo with my hair up like this. I think with a shoulder this strong and a color this light, I need hair to really balance this look. But, you know, I had my hair off my neck today while I was sewing because it's warm now. So this is what we've got. But thank you. Thank you for bearing with me while I look dissonant, as I said. It's very kind of you. And